Yes.
I didn't break it.
Oh yeah. I just said it.
Also, bear with me because psychology has kind of broken me in that I structure everything APA style, APA paper style now, so it's kind of in that flow, but I'll try and talk fast through the description of what I actually did. Good? Okay. So, for my combined honors and psychology capstone project, I conducted a research study with Dr. Erin Tooley and Karen Bellotti, who are both here today. Thank you guys for being here. The study took place at the tutoring center here on campus, and we were looking to get an idea of the stress levels, the amount of identification that tutors have with their position as a tutor, and also any resilience qualities that we might find in the tutoring population across the three centers, writing, math, and science. So, I've gone through a bunch of this already, actually. We also wanted to look at burnout in tutors because we figured that after a while, especially in some centers where you constantly have people coming in, you're going to eventually get a little tired of it, or you're going to, experience some sort of stress as a result of that. And so we wanted to kind of identify that because the tutoring center has actually not had a program evaluation in the past. And so this was kind of like a way of making a joint program evaluation plus this research study. So then after we were done with the study, we could actually hand it off to Karen for her to be able to use in the future as sort of an assessment tool of each year or each semester for all of the tutors that are there. Yes, and so the ultimate goal that we have is to, well, first of all, to identify what's going on and what the prevalence of stress and burnout and all that kind of stuff is in the tutoring center, and also to potentially come up with a sort of intervention or maybe an addition to the tutor training. So in the future, if we find that it's like a common trend that there's high stress levels every year, either the university or the tutoring center or someone can be able to employ something that will minimize those levels and keep tutors tutoring and keep them in a healthy mental space. So when we were digging through the research, there's actually no one has ever done this before. All the studies that have been done are focusing on the students coming into the tutoring center for tutoring and how the tutors can better themselves to better serve the student population, but no one's really focused on the impact that tutoring has on the tutors themselves. And so in a way, that was really exciting because we found this new branch of research that we get to pioneer, but in a way it's kind of daunting because you have nothing to compare your work to in the end. You have no way of telling if any scales that you come up with yourself are valid, so it's kind of, breaking through this initial barrier of there being nothing in the literature and using what we do have, such as like therapist burnout indexes, or, if we can drudge up any other universities' progress reports or program evaluations or anything, and use anything that we can to sort of throw together this brand new whole survey that we can then disseminate to all of the tutors and try and figure things out for the first time. So these are all of the scales and measures that we used. It was a kind of a long survey. The first one was an assessment of personality type so that we could see if there were any common personality traits across tutors. That's a version of the International Personality Item Pool, which is over 3,000 items long, but each person sort of puts together their own version for their own study based on what they want to look into. And so we used Goldberg's because in that particular study, the IPIP that was put together for it was specifically focused around the big 5 personality traits. And then we had a self-identification questionnaire that I created for this study, and then a tutor program evaluation questionnaire, which I also created, the Oldenburg Burnout Inventory, which is used for all kinds of different populations, but specifically we looked at a couple that used it in a therapist setting to tell if therapists were experiencing burnout. The perceived stress score scale, that's kind of self-explanatory. the tutor stress index, which is another one that I created, the brief resiliency scale, and the mindful attention awareness scale. So for the most part, they're self-explanatory as to what they're actually looking into. In terms of our participants, we had people from all three centers represented, mostly from the writing center, and then second place was the math center, followed by the science center. Mostly white females, most common respondent was a sophomore, followed very closely by freshmen. And the GPA range was 3.27 to 4.0, might have even been a little higher because we had a category for 4.0 or higher, so there could have even been people who had greater than a 4.0 GPA. And most respondents were currently enrolled in 5 classes, although there were as few as 3 and as many as 7 plus. So what we found after we looked into everything is, first and foremost, there's a very high stress level in the population for this particular age group. The average stress for the particular index that we used is 14.2, I believe, and the average stress for a tutor was 28, yeah. So double what the average stress level is for a student of this age group. But we actually found that while the stress in general about your life was high, the stress related specifically to the tutor's jobs and what they have to do on a daily basis was actually relatively moderate. We had a very high level of tutor identification, so the tutors were very likely and inclined to say that tutoring is not just a job for me, I actually identify as this is part of who I am. Normal level of resilience for this age group, and also an average level of mindfulness. So, kind of the 5, getting a little bit more specific, the 5 most significant findings that we ultimately got. First of all, mindfulness is negatively associated with both types of burnout. So we split the burnout scale is split into 2 parts. One is exhaustion, and one is disengagement. And so the more mindful a tutor is, the less likely they are to experience both kinds of burnout and also general stress, not the tutor stress, but general stress. Tutor stress is positively associated with both types of burnout, which we kind of expected because if you're more stressed, you're more likely to experience burnout. Conscientiousness is negatively associated with both types of burnout, so the more conscientious you are, the less likely you are to experience burnout. Resilience was negatively associated with stress. That kind of makes sense. If you're able to pick yourself up after a setback very easily, then you're less likely to be stressed. And something that was very interesting for us is that tutor identification is negatively associated with both types of burnout and stress, both types of stress, and it's positively associated with agreeableness and conscientiousness. So what that means is the more that a tutor identifies as being a tutor, the less likely they are to experience burnout and stress, both related to their own job as a tutor and also in general. And agreeableness and conscientiousness, so the tutors who identify as tutors are more likely to be agreeable and conscientious. So then we compared the 3 centers separately and to see if there were any similarities or differences across centers, and we only found 2 statistically significant differences between centers. So math tutors were more conscientious than writing tutors, and science tutors were more mindful than math tutors. So you can kind of maybe, I know there are a couple of tutors in here today, you can kind of make your own reasoning behind that. It might be because, math, you have more responsibility, you have to, go into the classes, you have to, help students with the homework, and you're expected to know all the material for the class, so maybe they're able to be more conscientious about that than the writing tutors who, anyone who comes in, you help them with anything. And then science tutors and math tutors, I don't know, I don't want to get into that. That seems like a bit of a debate there. So we did obviously have some limitations, just like any study does. The sample size, although it was far greater than we had anticipated originally, we thought that we would have 40 responses or so. We ended up having around 58 or 60 or so. So that really surprised us. but still, it's limited. We had originally in the beginning said 120, but whatever, we couldn't pay them, we couldn't give them credit, we couldn't do anything to incentivize them, so it's not their fault. And also the demographic, so we're a mostly white university in the Northeast, so it's very limited in terms of you can't really generalize that too much. It's also a very specific target population, so we're targeting only tutors, and so if there are any differences between tutors and regular students, then we won't be able to account for that. Also, there was some survey dropouts, so some people would start taking it, and then halfway through, I kind of don't blame them because it took like 15 minutes to complete it. People would just stop halfway through sometimes. Or they wouldn't complete like the demographic information, so we wouldn't necessarily be able to understand, how many classes you're taking, how, what's your gender, what's your, so we didn't have a perfectly complete profile of who was engaging in this, but we got a lot of the really good information in the very beginning, which was, kind of the meat of it, the level of identification, the stress level, that type of stuff. The use of new and unverified scales, obviously we aren't sure if the ones that I created are valid or not. So that'll be something that we'll have to continue in the future to see if we can see anything about that. And like I said before, there's no comparable data really. So there are a number of applications. We're going to actually continue this research next semester so that we can see if we can find any additional information, get even more data to get a more complete picture. We could also potentially apply this to other universities as well. It's not at all limited to just Roger Williams University. This is a fairly generic test that could be applied to any university, really. So this is kind of the interdisciplinary nature of this also made it kind of interesting because you're taking writing studies and you're taking psychology and you're merging them together, and so that gets not only are you having conversations about psychology and the implications of all these things, but you're also saying, oh well, writing studies, we have to take into account that, and we have to take into account the proficiency, the tutoring strategies, all that kind of stuff. This also allowed us to address the lack of previous research because we're now putting out some research so that people can potentially, if they want to, pick up on this, do their own versions of the studies. We are hoping to publish this eventually. So, and also this is kind of another overlap is this isn't just like a tutoring issue or just a writing issue. This is also a mental health issue. Like I said before, there's very high stress levels, and so there might be something that we could be able to do on the mental health front with this information as well. So for people who don't know, I am a writing tutor actually, so this is kind of like, my baby a little bit. So I'm personally invested in this. I've been a writing tutor for all 4 years, and so I had kind of a vested interest in, making the program better, leaving a mark on the tutoring center so that, in the future, people can be even better off. And the tutoring center, we have like thousands of tutoring sessions every year, and so that has a direct impact on the Roger Williams University community. And so by helping this one small section of the university, we're helping to kind of better the rest of the university as well. This gave me kind of a new perspective on research also. I have no intentions of going into research, and I didn't even particularly like it up until this point, but it's kind of changed my mind a little bit. And like I said in the beginning, this was kind of a daunting task because we're going in blind largely. We didn't have anything to base it on, and I really think that the honors program and my experience in all of the classes up to this point have really helped me to get through this and push it, especially because we finished collecting data like a week and a half ago, so to throw everything together for this thing was insane, and it was so stressful, but all of that experience in all the honors classes where you have that higher expectation, the higher caliber of material, the more investment that's necessary, and I think that really benefited me in this instance to help me persevere through all of this. And also I believe that this is kind of a perfect end to my honors career because one of the first things that we do is the community connections, where we're giving back to various people and organizations in the Bristol area. And now I'm kind of, as a senior at the very end, kind of giving back to the community once again. So it's kind of to ends. So I thought that that was a good way of ending things. In the future, we are planning on continuing it. We have actually approved grant funding, so we'll have a couple $1,000s to be able to pay everybody like 1,000?
Yeah, just the 1,000.
Just the 1,000, okay. So like $5 each for every person, so maybe that'll boost our participation rates. Like I said before, we're hoping to submit it to a scientific journal eventually, and then possibly we're also going to expand it to non-tutors as well, and so that's when probably the money will come in really handy. And so closing thoughts, like I was saying before a little bit, and I'll skim through this because I'm probably way over, but the tutors really interact with the population in a way that not many other departments do. They are, like when a student comes in, and I can only speak for the Writing Center because I only work there, but when they come in, a lot of the times they're uncertain, they're shy, walking into this new environment, they're scared, they're concerned about showing their writing. It's a very vulnerable experience. And so that one interaction between the tutor and the student is capable of changing the student's entire perspective on that assignment or on the class in general or on education in general. And it can be a really inspiring process, that one sit down between those two people. And so making sure that you're keeping the tutors who are facilitating all of this as healthy as possible and keeping them, motivated and wanting to continue to be a tutor instead of, dropping out or, finding another job or something like that is a really important process and a really important thing that the university, I think, should prioritize. And so hopefully through this data and the future data that we're going to come out with, something really meaningful will come out of this. And that's my hope as I walk out the figurative door. So that is it.
We're good?
Very good.
So I want to start just by thanking everybody for coming today, taking time out of your busy schedules. I know with finals coming, it's getting hectic, but thank you. So my name's Emily Stopel. In my time here at Roger Williams, I've been a secondary education and English Lit double major. And I want to start off with just some information about me. So in my time here, I've been formed by so much more than just my major. I spent 4 years as a member of the lacrosse team, sort of freshman year to senior year. It's been bittersweet, but that's occupied a lot of my time. If you see me on campus, especially Karen walking past her office to work, you've seen me in all of my lacrosse gear every time. I also work in the Writing Center. I have loved my experience in the Writing Center, and like Trey said, it is an experience that's so interesting because you have so many different influences. And I actually found that my time in the Writing Center impacted the way in which I wrote my thesis and the way in which I went about revising my thesis. So that was something that was really important to me. I also have experience volunteering in the community. My sophomore year, I helped found the Rotaract Club, and I've been serving as secretary since then. It's given me experiences in the Roger Williams community and in the Bristol community, and that I've been able to serve and experience so many things I never would have otherwise. In my time at Honors, I have loved my entire experience. Coming in freshman year and immediately having that connection, having those people that you want to stay up with, even when it's 4 in the morning and you're talking about lit fill and it makes no sense anymore, you just keep talking. And that experience, from our time at Community Connections to our trip to Taza, all of that has been amazing, and it's really informed the way in which I view the world and the way in which I went about writing my paper. So one of the most formative experiences for me during my time was I went abroad my junior year. I studied at the University of Westminster in London, and I was able to go to 10 different countries. And that really expanded my desire to learn about the history of different places. Before that, I had been very much an English major. I wanted to read from books, I wanted to learn from books. But being able to travel, if there was a free walking tour, I was on that tour no matter where it was going. And I just loved learning about the history of different things, and it really informed the thesis I ended up writing, and I will go into that later. I am also a sister. I thought that that was important because my brother, shout out to him, read my thesis many, many times, even though it was way longer than it should have been. And he really helped me to edit it and go through it and find out where I had the curse of knowledge, because I would write things and assume that everyone knew what I was talking about. Nobody knew what I was talking about other than me. So, as I mentioned earlier, I believe, my thesis was an evolutionary redefinition of the education of women. Jane Eyre and Hermione Granger and the influence of the female voice. Dr. Robinson and Dr. Case both were very influential in this thesis, and they both assisted me strongly as I was writing it, sort of that entire process. For anyone who doesn't know, the English thesis is really broken up into 2 separate semesters. Your first semester happens the spring of your junior year, and you spend most of that brainstorming, figuring out what you want to write about. Then I had the summer to work on it independently, and then last fall I worked on it, revised it, and I eventually presented it at a colloquium in December of last semester. This was an experience writing it that was an amazing experience, but also absolutely horrendous at the same time, because it was just going back and back and back. But as I was writing it, I found that there were a lot of different things I hadn't initially considered. When I began writing, I was just writing about Jane Eyre and Harry Potter, and that's all I wanted to focus on in my paper. As I was writing, though, I found that doing research and contributing, sort of pulling in the way in which a place's history impacts the characters that are written about, really formed my thesis in the end. I ended up looking at the way in which education evolved from the time of Jane Eyre through Hermione Granger. So there's 150 years separating these 2 characters in the literary canon, yet they're more similar than I ever would have thought. When I was looking at this evolution initially, I thought that Jane Eyre was going to not want to learn, she was going to want to be in her household, she was sort of going to have her entire experience formed around the house. And I thought that Hermione Granger was this free spirit who only wanted to learn, she wanted to break the patriarchy, she wanted to do all of these things. Upon actually completing my thesis, I found that that was not the progression that was followed at all. Jane Eyre was a character and a woman who wanted to learn. She was curious, she was naturally intelligent, she was teaching herself to read even when that was something that was discouraged by society. However, that was repressed, and she was taught instead how to sew, how to speak French, and how to play piano. Those were the classes that were focused on as she got into schooling. Even as she grew older and became the head of her own household, it was her marriage that she was praised for. She wasn't praised for her literary achievements, the fact that she could read, even though she was a woman, the fact that she wanted to raise her daughter with proper educational values. These are things that weren't focused on because they weren't values in her time period. I then looked at Hermione Granger, and she was a girl who wanted to learn. She wanted to learn everything that she had the chance to, and she even overcame time in the 3rd book when she didn't have enough time to take all of those classes. So Hermione Granger was that free-spirited character who wanted to break the patriarchy. She wanted to show all of the boys everything that she could do, and she proved everyone wrong. But even though Hermione Granger was a strong character, I didn't see her as necessarily completely representative of her time period. Because upon research, I focused a lot on the educational system of the United Kingdom. I found that it was a linear progression. It wasn't represented by these 2 characters, because it was represented only by what women were allowed to do, not what they wanted to do. So the summer, I mentioned that I wrote my thesis basically in 2 semesters. The summer between those 2 semesters, I spent a lot of time reading literary critics. I read literary critics that wrote anything basically. If you typed in Jane Eyre in education or Hermione Granger in education, I read it. I read all of it, and none of the critics that I was reading looked at this evolution, looked at the way in which their time periods impacted how they were written or how they acted. So that was something that I was really interested in looking at, and I knew that I needed to include in my thesis in order to make it fully comprehensive. So my thesis eventually ended up being about Jane Eyre and Hermione Granger, but it was also about the way in which society impacts females, rather than just being about those 2 characters. Because it was the patriarchy in both Jane Eyre's time and Hermione's time that really formed the way in which they were acting. So even though my thesis was super interesting to me, I know it doesn't appeal to everyone. So my purpose today is more to connect this work that I have done to my honors experience. One of the first connections I made, as I mentioned earlier, was the curse of knowledge. This is something that we talked about at our first honors retreat. I talked about it with Dr. Reynolds in my Core 102 class. I talked about it with Dr. Case in my Core 104 class. It's something us honors kids struggle with a lot, so they talk about it with us a lot. And I found that I still continue to struggle with it. But because I was aware of this issue, because of all of my time in honors and all of the discussion that we had about it, I was able to identify those areas that I talked about Harry Potter in a way that nobody else knows Harry Potter. And I was able to make those adjustments, and in the end I believe that my thesis was a lot more readable almost. You could read it even if you didn't have that background in Harry Potter that I did, or even if you hadn't read Jane Eyre, because most people don't want to. Most people don't want to pick up a book that's that long and read a description about a about a couch for 5 pages. But I was able to break it down. I was able to make it understandable to the common person just because I knew about the curse of knowledge. So that was incredibly helpful. One of the other implications was, as I said, I looked a lot at the societal implications of education as a whole. So even though I was looking at the United Kingdom, there are a lot of parallels between the United Kingdom's educational system and the United States educational system after about 1800. So I believe that there's transfer between them. In both countries, the educational achievement gap is identified by standardized testing today. This is something that wasn't present in Harry Potter, but it is a really big deal in society today because there is still an educational gap. This gap is not between men and women, as many would expect. This gap is instead between different races and different ethnicities. This gap is something that needs to be identified, and it can't just be assumed that the gap is because, oh, they're a different race. Other factors such as poverty, distance from school, all of these things are things that need to be considered. Additionally, another connection that I made, as I was researching, I fell into a lot of holes in Google. I would read about anything related to education, regardless of if it was related to education in the United Kingdom or even the time periods I was focused on. One of the numbers that I came across was 130 million. This is the number of girls that's estimated by UNESCO that are out of school between the ages of 6 and 17. This is a number that's drawn from sort of an international estimate, but this number, of that number, 15 million of these girls will likely never set foot in a classroom. So although we can say, we're all in higher education, there are men in this room, there are women in this room, that's not the case around the world, and that's something that really needs to be considered because this is an issue still, and it can't just be assumed that it's gone away just because we are 150 years past when Jane Eyre was written. Additionally, there are other causes for this inequity. In addition to poverty being a cause for girls to not attend school, physical proximity to schools is also an issue. So in areas where you are likely walking to school, being an additional kilometer from school decreases your chances of actually attending school by 50%. So just because you're walking to school, it limits the chance that you have to go to school, which increases child marriages, it increases the abuse that women face because they aren't able to get these educations, they aren't able to sort of get past their situation. They're forced to live in their household and forced to live in that way. So as I was going through, I was thinking a lot about the role of a citizen scholar. We talked about this through all of our honors courses, and it was something that kept on coming up. So I thought that the role of the citizen scholar was to use the information that we're privileged enough to learn in order to engage with and meaningfully contribute to the world around us. So I know this information. As an English major, I don't know what I would do with that information, but as an education major, I do know that I am able to make a difference and I am able to apply everything that I've learned. I am likely not going to be able to make nearly a dent in that 130 million, but I will have a classroom full of students that I will be able to impact. So although we can take our own experiences in higher education to mean that society's improved and removed some of the inequality that had previously existed, we have to be open to other people's experiences and educate ourselves in order to act as informed citizens. We must be acting as these citizen scholars rather than just taking it at face value and saying, no, I'm good, I figured it out, I'm okay. I think that as I was going through this thesis process, there were limitations. I was still taking 21 credits last semester, so I was not able to devote nearly as much time as I wanted to this project. I ended up sort of rushing through the end, so I wasn't able to sit down and really stew with this information. Now that I'm a semester removed, there are so many things that I wish that I could change. I wish that I could look more at the way in which women were able to actually make an impact in society. I looked at the more formative years, so it wasn't looking at how they were represented in government, how they were represented in the workforce. Those are all things that I wish that I could have gotten to, and maybe if I go back to write my master's thesis, this might be something that I'm willing to explore, but at this point that was a serious limitation for my work. Then how I'm impacted. I mentioned that I am an education major. This semester I'm placed at Mount Hope High School in Bristol, and even in Bristol there is that inequity that's still present. It's not gender inequity, but it is racial and economic inequity. In the way in which students are expected to learn, it's assumed that everyone has money in Bristol because it's Bristol, it's beautiful. Have you seen downtown? But there are kids in Warren who I know struggle with homelessness, struggle with food inequality. And reaching out to those kids and being able to bring them into my classroom and bring them into learning, despite those things, is something that I did not expect as a teacher. I wasn't necessarily prepared for it after reading about it out of the book. It was very different to experience it. So now that I've experienced that and gone through all of the research that I've gone through, I'm sort of making a decision, as all seniors are. I don't know where I want to go. It would be very easy to go to a suburban school, have all the kids with their perfect lives come into my classroom every day, ready to learn, full food in their stomach, fully rested. But realistically, that's not where I'm going to make a difference. I would be able to make a difference in an urban school where I'd be able to reach out to students, I'd be able to transform, not necessarily transform, that's a lot for me to do. I'd be able to help them through the transformative years of their life. I'd be able to assist someone in need of Rose. These are all things that I haven't come to conclusions about, but I am still questioning, I am still figuring out what I'm going to do. So, there's my works cited, and then I as well have questions cited. So thank you.
I'd like to invite all three of our presenters back to the stage. Audience members, if you have questions for them, how does their work relate to honors program values? How did they go about doing their projects, if you're thinking ahead for yourself down the road? If you have questions about their topics. And so, I'll let the students go first. Or, sorry, Dr. Ron, because I cut you off in the last session.
No, go ahead.
I want to give you the first
Students
question.
first.
All right, students first, then Professor Ron.
Cameron, first of all, I thought you were all great, so just in the spirit of time, I'll make one observation about one project. So first of all, I loved it, and I've been to the Seaport, so I have a very general sense to the area. But one thing that struck me is sort of your concept of community, and what community means, because particularly in a place like the Seaport, it's a very complicated concept. And as gentrification happens and the history of places, there's different communities. Right. And based on the art nature, one of the things that struck me, certainly particularly in an urban community and the physical space that you've designed, is the idea of the murals projects that a lot of places like Philadelphia have used, particularly in challenged areas. Because I think one of the communities that still has a chance of being lost in that project is the disenfranchised communities in Boston that are disconnected from these vibrant places. And just on the physical space itself, it just struck me that you have such a great opportunity to carve out physical space for truly local communities and really engage young people in an art space that's an eclectic space where you could almost earmark one place as a mural that local community can own and can have some control over. So first of all, I think it was a great project. I just encourage you to the degree that you have it, and you probably have, to sort of think in community in a more holistic sense, and not just a displaced art community. So anyway, just an observation.
For sure.
Other comments, questions, discussion points?
So I have a question for Emily, and this is, you were talking a little bit about, and this might be just a point of clarification about your findings, is that you were talking a little about comparing these two figures, right, who are from different historical periods, right, and you expected to see this larger difference, right, but it seemed like you were saying that there wasn't such a huge difference as you expected. Is that like an accurate characterization of what your sort of findings are? Or it seemed like you were saying that there was something else a little bit.
There's something else with society. I hadn't necessarily taken society into account, so I saw Jane Eyre, who ended the novel married to the man that she loved, just raising a household. And then you have Hermione, who's this very victorious figure. So I, with those images in mind, didn't necessarily see their growth as characters. And then when looking at the evolution, I found that society had such a large impact on them when I had just been thinking of them as individuals sort of stuck in time. I hadn't necessarily anticipated the other sort of the impact that society had on them. So that was like the other thing I didn't anticipate before writing my thesis that really ended up driving it. I don't know if that makes sense.
So less of an understanding of these, of the character as a sort of timeless sort of archetype, so understanding
Yeah.
how the society at that time impacted who they were?
Yeah, because when I started writing it, I was thinking very generally, and I was like, I'm just gonna write about this person and not really write about the rest of the book, not write about anything that impacted them. And then I found that society had such a large impact on them and such a large impact on their actions that that wasn't something that I could really ignore.
Okay, thanks.
And just to spread the questions around, Trey, if I heard you right, you said that their tutor stress levels were generally low, however, their overall stress levels were high. Do you think that is a correlation where does tutoring attract stressed out people? Is that what you're saying? And then my follow-on question would be, what should we, the Graduate Leaders community, do to help those who are helping others in the tutoring center? I mean, what should we do to help the tutors with their stress? So that was a two-part question.
Yeah. So for the first part, I don't know that it's kind of hard to tell the direction of that in a way, because on the one hand, it could be that, when you're recruiting people who are already, type A personality, as we saw, they're all really conscientious, so they're, more likely to get their work done right away and, be very rigorous, the lowest GPA being almost a 3.3, with the majority in the high 3 range. So it's probably that they're coming in already, coming out of high school with, all A's, and then, determined to throw themselves into college and continue to, be that, that high achievement, oriented student, because, Karen goes through and she handpicks every single writing tutor based on their, their application and their high school transcript. And so, she's plucking the best of the best already, and so it makes sense that they would be, stressed out right off the bat. But then, of course, as you move through your college career, anyone gets stressed. Even people who aren't tutors, even people who don't necessarily keep up very good grades. There's other stressors that are part of college life.
Can I actually comment on that too? Yeah. We have the college population right now is the most stressed out college population that we've ever seen. So I'm actually wondering if when we look at a sample of non-tutors, I bet we're not going to see significant differences in stress level. I think everybody's just going to be pretty stressed.
Yeah. And so then in terms of what to do about it, there could be a couple of different things. We could create and just make a whole new intervention that we could. It could be like a program or like a specific meeting that's entirely focused on like mental health and stress reduction or something like that. We haven't quite gotten to that point yet. Or it could be something that we would maybe tweak with the tutor training in the beginning of the semester and throughout the semester, that we could build in some stress management techniques. We could maybe partner with the counseling center and see if they have any suggestions that they could offer. Or we could just, raise awareness. Something like this now raises awareness. It's not just you that's stressed. We're all really stressed. So what can we do now that we know that moving forward? I think that it can definitely be a joint effort on the part of the tutoring center, the university, the counseling center, and the individual students. So it's probably going to be not just one intervention, not just one solution, but many.
I'd like to, go ahead, question. No.
I really liked when you were talking about how architecture, you see that as a medium is intricately linked with the public realm and communication, and also find it interesting and sadly realistic about the comment that it's hard to get funding for these projects that aren't in already upkept areas. How do you see the other facet of architecture meeting that more monetary driven end to get projects like that?
So basically you're asking like how
would you incentivize
a project that type of project? I think it starts with having a kind of a flagship project that people can turn to see something. So something like that echelon thing that I talked about, that people can see the transformative nature and the potential of something like that coming into a community in kind of a disenfranchised district, and kind of having that like social and economic uplift and that effect on that community. And then being able to use that as something that you can point to and be like, here, they did it here. So like, there's no reason why you can't use it in different applications. So that's kind of, I think that's kind of hopefully the way to go. And I think that people are starting, there's a lot of push for urban renewal these days. So I think as we start to run out of space and stuff in downtown districts, they'll obviously be forced to look elsewhere. But I think it's important that we keep in mind that while we're moving we're expanding our cities, we're not actually pushing out all the populations that currently live there, and kind of trying to figure out ways to expand a city and have that urban growth, but without kind of disenfranchising those populations that are already kind of struggling, that are already there. As far as your comment earlier, I also did try to include some of the some places that people can go that aren't like art focused and that sort of thing. So, and obviously it's an arts campus, and there's that focus there. But a lot of importance is kind of placed on having places that people could go and kind of just relax and hang out. So there's a big like lounging, like a rooftop terrace, and the whole thing was kind of like a free admission sort of. You can kind of walk around. There's cafes and like free screenings of movies and stuff like that. So while it is focused on the artistic community, or I don't want to say focused, but there's definitely a artistic kind of flair to the whole campus itself. It can kind of be tailored to whoever really wants to come and enjoy that space. Become this formative space that really brings everybody together. So, yes. A lot. It was kind of like $1 million project. So for studio projects, in America, they don't tend to give you a budget per se. So it's kind of that theoretical aspect. Yeah, go all out and kind of do what you can. But so yeah, that would have certainly been pretty pricey. Like I said, the slate was almost half a mile long. So
He's such a good kid.
Building projects on that sort of scale would be pretty pricey, especially here. Filling in parts of an old former dry dock, filling. So that's a pretty large scale.
Nice job. Get our next group in here. And sign up sheets around. Thank you very much. All right.
I forgot where I was.
Come on in. Come on in. Michaela, come on in. Present yours.
4:45 to 5.
Sit up.
Because I wanted to do the question and answer, but you did a great job.
Thank you. Sorry.
I don't know if that's the naming convention for when you create your own. I really like Powers Resonate. Thank you. If I made a note of that.
I thought about asterisks. I thought about, how can I denote when you're 16 a real thing?
Is there like some sort of precedent, like template for creating your own?
One more thing here.
Kind of throw in there, so yeah, pretty. Yeah, you just have to then make sure that it's actually testing what J's are intending it to test. Okay. So that's the only thing that you need other people to do. Studying it. Yeah, and you can be like, oh, okay, this is probably a good way to measure. So maybe we need to be.
Sounds good. Look, I would love to partake in the study if it opens up to general students.
Oh, yeah. Next
Becky just brought me like that exact. Hi.
Really?
Look at you, you look so professional. Thank you. Watch out.
How do I get this? Your cord.
Good to see you.
Same here.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our final session of our senior capstone presentations at Sash. Senior capstone, every honor student is required to do a capstone project that requires research or creativity or applies the knowledge they've learned to do something. And this is a chance for us to celebrate those projects, learn about what our seniors have done, but more importantly, learn about how the work they've done connects to the broader world. So not just what did you do within education or biology or whatever the field was, why should we care about it? Why is it relevant? Not just to us, the world, but also to the students and their own growth and development. Part of education is learning knowledge and skills, but another part of it is learning how to be the role, the profession that you're growing into, right? How do you be a teacher? How do you be a scientist? And so an opportunity for the students to share their reflections on how their education has shaped them and where they're going and how they'll continue to be citizen scholars going forward. I will let each of our presenters introduce themselves to save a little time. We're going to do all three presentations in a row, and then we'll have a little bit of time afterwards for questions and discussion. Students who are in the room, if you could sign our little sign-in sheet, I'll pass that around. And otherwise, we'll get started. So, go ahead.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Michaela Golding, and I did my capstone project with Dr. Allen again. Thanks for coming. And my project was called The Whitewashed Classroom, an analysis of the problematic Eurocentric education system. So I'm an education major. So just a quick definition of what whitewash means. In terms of education, an example of whitewashing would be how we learn about Christopher Columbus being this great guy. This is really biased information, and it's overly optimistic. And when something is whitewashed, it can sometimes be inaccurate. So another quick definition is culturally relevant pedagogy. So the difference between curriculum and pedagogy is the curriculum is what we teach, whereas pedagogy is how we teach. So culturally relevant pedagogy is basically when a teacher forms really strong relationships with their students and is able to get a really good grasp on what that student's personality and culture is individually, and they're able to fold that into the pedagogy and curriculum in the classroom. Just a quick statistic up here. This is from the 2010 census, so it's a little bit off because clearly that was 9 years ago. But in the 2010 census, there were 40 million foreign-born immigrants in the United States, and that, of course, was the census, so that's illegal immigrants. And this equates to 13% of the population, 12.9% of the population. So this number more than likely has grown since the 2010 census. And that's just to give us an idea of how many students in our classroom are foreign-born. This is not to say that if a student was born in America, they don't also have another culture that we have to keep in mind. Everybody, even if you were born in America, your family may be from another country, and you may celebrate that culture. So in my research, the two big concepts that I focused on was the historic accuracy of the curriculum that we teach and the cultural relevance of the curriculum that we teach. So the question that I asked myself was, how can we ensure that our students are learning accurate and unbiased information from various perspectives, so not just our Eurocentric information, while still being inspired and motivated with their own culture. So some of you may recognize this woman. She is from a really famous TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story. I know they listen to that at the Honors Retreat now. And if you don't know her story, basically she is from Nigeria, and at the time that she's talking about this little anecdote here, she had never been outside of Nigeria before. And she discusses how when she was younger, she used to read British literature books and American literature books. And when she decided that she wanted to start writing, she wrote stories about white people with blue eyes and blonde hair, and they ate fruit she'd never heard of, and they played in the snow. So this is just a little example of how the curriculum that we teach in our classroom can give that single story. And she had thought that she couldn't write a story about someone like herself because she'd never seen anything like that. So when I started my analysis of the curriculum, I started with literature. And the first thing that I analyzed was the top 100 most popular required readings in America. And on this list, 50 of the authors were white men. This equated to about 70% of the list. That's because people like William Shakespeare and other very, very famous authors had multiple pieces of work on the list. 21 of the authors were white women, and together the white men and women made up over 90% of this list, and 7 of the authors were people of color. This was mostly African American writers, such as Maya Angelou, but there was 1 Mexican writer and 1 Asian writer, and that was it for people of color. That equated to 9% of the authors on the list. After I looked at the most popular readings, I looked at banned and challenged books in America. So these are books that not necessarily are banned right now, but stuff like Catcher in the Rye that may have been banned in the past. And that percentage doubled. So the people of color, the authors of color, who the percentage was doubled from 9 to 18% on that list. So that gives us an idea of what kind of people are being banned in the classroom, what stories they're telling. So this here is Maya Angelou, and she's one of the most banned authors, poets in the United States. And this is a quote from the Banned and Challenged website that describes why Maya Angelou's book, I Know Why the Caged Birds Sing, is banned in so many different places. So if they talk about how it has bitterness and hatred towards white people, as well as it displays deviant behavior in terms of lesbianism and premarital sex. So this message that we're sending to students is that any vision that opposes the white man is incorrect, and we can't read that. It's not appropriate for schools, as well as anything in the LGBT realm, not appropriate for schools. I next moved on to history. So this is, some of you may have heard of this. It was very much so in the press recently. This book was published in 2015. It's a McGraw-Hill textbook that I'm sure most of us know what McGraw-Hill is, a very famous textbook company. And they posted this page here of the patterns of immigration in the United States. And then this quote just comes from right here. And it says that the Atlantic slave trade between the 1500s and 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations. So as I'm sure most of you can realize, they're talking about slavery. And what this does for students is that gives us a very positive view for the white people. We brought them over, we gave them jobs, we helped them start a new life in America. And for the black community, it's really pushes down and oppresses them and really shows us that their perspective does not matter, because clearly it does not express any of the burdens that they did go through. And like I discussed earlier, how whitewashing is typically historically inaccurate. They were not workers, they were not paid, that's not what the definition of a worker is, and it doesn't give any definition into how brutal their lives were. Here's another example of the exaggerated heroism in our textbooks. So I am currently placed in a second grade classroom, and we read and learned a lot about George Washington in February around President's Day. And so from the textbooks that I read and from the online videos and websites that are like for kids, educational websites, this is a general definition that you would get about George Washington, that he was a very respected man. He wanted freedom for the whole country. He was unanimously voted in, so that means he had the best ideas. Everyone agreed with him. And they always put in that fun fact that he had wooden teeth, which is not even true, and that he attempted to create this free country. But in reality, George Washington was a slave owner, so clearly he did not want freedom for everybody. And he also called for the destruction of the indigenous people in the eastern side of America, the Iroquois. And this wasn't just for space, he called for the destruction of people of every age and sex, so he wanted children, women, everybody out of the northeastern part of America. George Washington was also an advocate for biological warfare, germ warfare. He never went through with this, but his advocacy for this inspired Andrew Jackson later in life, who's also another president that we view as a very positive and influential man in our history. He inspired Andrew Jackson to go through, and Andrew Jackson did perform this warfare in the Seminole War. So here's just some examples of effects on students' brains that we can have when their cultures are not presented in their curriculum. So I'm a girl of Mexican descent. No US presidents have ever been Mexican, nor have they ever been female. I will never be president. I'm a boy of Asian descent who struggles in math class. All Asians are good at math. I don't fit it with my own race, nor do I fit it with any other races. So this bottom one here is an actual example that I read in an article. And he describes how it's very typically associated as a positive stereotype, because it's putting your race and your culture in a good light. But when you don't fit in with that, it sort of ostracizes you from your own culture. This quote down here is from a girl named Marcella. She lives in Tucson, Arizona. I don't know if anybody is familiar with what is going on in Tucson, Arizona in the past few years, but there was this whole ethnic studies curriculum, and the superintendent of the education program in Tucson decided that the ethnic studies curriculum that taught Mexican American studies, he deemed it anti-American and racist because it was very culturally relevant and it was not whitewashed, and it did portray American events in poor light when it truly happened that way. So he had eliminated it and banned it, and I have some photos later of the protests, but in short, the people were able to protest. It took them very, very many years, but they were able to get their ethnic studies courses back. But this was a direct hit at that specific race. They had African culture classes and different ones, so they were specifically targeting that Mexican community. So just some benefits of multicultural education, which is also culturally relevant pedagogy. One huge one is that it enhances student identity. So it can really help a student in class be more confident in themselves. When you see yourself in the classroom, when you read books in your mother tongue, when you read books with people who look like you, when you do a math problem and it's stuff that you understand and that you can relate to, that can really boost confidence in the classroom. Another thing down here, it teaches students to collaborate and challenge injustices. A really great thing that a teacher can do is have their students do inquiry-based projects where perhaps you could take a textbook and read a page of it and see how they're portraying that person or that event, and then do your own research, find primary sources, and challenge this idea. So just my research conclusions. Number one is that textbooks cannot be a reliable standalone source. To truly teach history, what actually happened, how people acted, you need primary sources, direct quotes, photos for students to really be able to understand what happened in the truest form. Multi-perspective learning is essential for students to understand the world in which we live. When I was abroad last spring, and I was speaking with a group of international students about national holidays that all of our countries had, and someone said something about Thanksgiving, and they all looked at me and they were like, I'd love to hear what you have to say about this, because they knew I'd have that skewed view of what it was, because they know that we do this to ourselves, we put ourselves in the most positive light. And then finally, inquiry-based and culturally relevant learning is required for deep critical thought. And when students are looking at scholastic news, looking at textbooks, there's no critical thought. You're reading it, you're retaining it, maybe you're recreating it onto a paper for a test, and then it's out of your brain. So when students are learning in an inquiry-based manner, when they're figuring things out for themselves, maybe through primary source documents, and when it's related to their own culture and they're able to relate to the content, that is when deep critical thought is able to be activated. So through my research, I did have some limitations. First of all, I had limited textbooks available. Of course, I did not analyze every textbook that is out there. The main textbook that I did analyze was McGraw-Hill, and it was in 2005, and it's actually my friend who is teaching in Fall River right now, so it is active in schools today, I'm sure of that. My other limitation is that I can't make this claim that teachers are doing this to their students when I don't know the supporting resources that they're using along with the textbook. So I can't say that all of these repercussions are happening to all these students in America when I don't know what supporting resources teachers are using, even if they're using that textbook. So who does this affect on our planet? All these little dots here represent somewhere in the world that one of my students is from. So I have a student from Guatemala, Puerto Rico, Nigeria, South Africa, Germany, Japan, and the Philippines. And that's because I'm teaching Newport, so it's right on a Navy base. There's a lot of Navy families, so it's a particularly diverse area. And one way that we are able to really include all of these different cultures in the classroom is I have one student who's from, like I said, he's from Guatemala, and he's actually a refugee. And so he came to America very unexpectedly, didn't learn any English. And so we have students, I have two students from Guatemala, one does speak English, and then I have another student from Puerto Rico, and they're able to help him teach the class Spanish. So he'll say something in Spanish, then the class will, the translator will replay it in English, and then they'll be able to learn that Spanish term. So he feels really included in the curriculum. Another way that I am able to do this in the classroom, we were learning about weather in the classroom, which you would think can't really be a very culturally relevant topic, rain and tornadoes, but we got into a deep lesson on the Puerto Rican Hurricane Maria, and we were able to really dive deep into that for a student who was really important to them because she had family there, and she was able to describe about the culture and the weather that she experienced. So why is this important? Multicultural curriculum and culturally relevant pedagogy, and also eliminating this idea of whitewashing, challenges the idea of stereotype threat. It doesn't make people think they have to fit into this box, or if they do fit into a box, that it's wrong. It also challenges ignorance in the classroom, as well as false heroism. So like I said, with George Washington, he's viewed as an American hero, but he did have all these negative aspects to him. So we do need to present both the positives and negatives. Same with Christopher Columbus, he's a false hero. And models, these ideas model for future generations how to be a tolerant and educated citizen scholar. So a lot of things that we talk about is giving back to the community in ways, interacting with the community in ways that we can through these inquiry-based things. One thing that we at Pell School do in Newport, they would raise fundraisers for different different cultures, that if something's happening in Puerto Rico, we have a really big Puerto Rican population, we can do a fundraiser or something like that. So they're able to really connect to the community engagement portion. So how has this project impacted me as a professional? So doing this research and seeing all these diverse students in my classroom, which is a school that is very unlike the school that I grew up in. I grew up in a very white town. I, as a teacher, am able to form really strong individualized relationships with my students and really get to know them on a deeper level so that I can fold in parts of them into our curriculum, make them more interested, listen to stories that are relevant to them. I'm also able to teach inquiry-based multicultural projects. When we learn about Native Americans, we don't just read out of the textbook that Thanksgiving happened and everything was fine and dandy, but we talk about what really happened, and they're 7 years old and they can grasp it. And it's something that can be a teacher's biggest downfall, is underestimating the extent to where their students can learn. And finally, it has inspired me to make that change, not teach just straight from the textbook, use primary sources, use other documents that I find myself to really teach the truth in my classroom. And so how does this relate to the 3 honors core questions? This, I felt, really fit into my project specifically because I'm able to ask myself these questions. Who am I as a teacher? What do I know and what do I need to find more out about? Because I went through an education system that was very Eurocentric, so I know that I always have more to learn. And based on what I know, how can I teach this? But these are also questions that I can ask about my students to find out more about them and to work their cultures into my classroom. So who are my students? What do they know? What is their culture? What's important to them? And how can I relate lessons to them? And so, like I said, these are the photos from the ethnic studies protests. So all the Mexican-American immigrants in Tucson, Arizona had banded together and they supported each other in protesting it. So what can we all do is to support local legislator that advocates for things that matter to you, such as culturally relevant pedagogy. Also joining local school boards. If you don't have children and you can't join a PTO, you can always join your town's system. Or if you are a teacher or a parent, you can join the PTO and really help to get that specific school to where you'd like it to be. And finally, just educate yourself so that I'm sure most of us grew up in a school where we learned a lot of false heroism. We didn't learn about African cultures. We didn't learn about all these different places in the world that have different perspectives on events that we learned about, but we only got that mono-perspective view of it.
All right, while this is loading. Okay, so my name is Lily Blau and I'm a senior education major. So my project is teaching tolerance, challenging students to explore injustice through history. So I just did this. So something about myself is that I'm from New Hampshire. I'm an elementary education major. I'm the president of FMRIC, which is Foundation for International Medical Relief of Children. So I work a lot with children and traveling to different countries. So I wanted to start off with my community engagement aspect of this only because, so my sophomore year of college, I went on a trip to Jamaica that was for a psychology class. And I was not an education major at the time. I was actually a psychology major. And after going on this trip, we went and it counted as an honors community engagement. We worked in the schools in Jamaica, and just this whole experience inspired me to change my major to education. So that's kind of why I incorporated this first, and it just got me really interested in the idea of different cultures and incorporating that into education. So my project kind of piggybacks on Michaela's, exactly. So it's kind of a continuation. So the question that I was curious about was, are elementary age children too young to engage in mature, respectful discussions about race and injustice? So this was something that I honestly wasn't sure about. I know that they are capable, such as Michaela said. A lot of times people underestimate what children are able to handle, what they're able to discuss and understand. But I was curious exactly how I could incorporate that into my classroom. I'm currently student teaching in Hugh Cole and Warren in a 5th grade classroom, so my students are 10 and 11 years old. So something that I wanted to start with was, what is teaching tolerance? So just a quote is that tolerance is respect, acceptance, and appreciation of the rich diversity of our world's cultures, our forms of expression, and ways of being human. So the goal is pretty much to help teachers and just schools in general to educate children on how to become more aware of diversity and to become activists themselves. So what my teaching event was, so for student teaching, you have to do a teaching event. So you create a unit. It's supposed to be 3 to 5 lessons. Mine ended up being over a month, so it was very long. And it was on the history of slavery in West Africa and the American colonies. So like Michaela was saying, a lot of times, that textbook was a perfect example. A lot of times slavery is portrayed as they were brought over as workers, and they were it was sort of by choice, or it was better for them to come here. So what my unit did was focus on the experience of the West Africans and their culture, and how one of the biggest things that we focused on was how their identity was taken away. And my students really got really involved in this. So we were able to, in turn, also connect it to slavery in Rhode Island. So that's something that some of the students knew about, but a lot of them were shocked to realize that there was slavery in Rhode Island. I know that all of this kind of sparked a lot of emotion from students. So after we learned about this, a couple of students were I was in Newport the other day and I saw the docks there, and I was just imagining, it really got them thinking about how this was so relevant to where we live now. Also, students, we were able to explore the injustice in the past. So we were able to think about how the issues that we're seeing in the past also have affected us in the future. So I'll get into this more, but talking about racism currently and how that kind of has mimicked the injustice that we saw in the past with slavery. And just kind of the goal of this whole unit was to create young citizen scholars. So we talked about this with them, I talked about this, and the goal for them was to really explore and be able to fully understand the issue of injustice in general, and to be able to, their goal in the end was they wanted to become more of an activist in their own community. So just some things that I pulled from the teaching event were, so students connected injustice in the past to issues in the present. So a lot of questioning was involved in this. So I did this as an inquiry-based unit. So this photo down here, for example, I showed that to them. I showed them a photo of West Africans actually in West Africa, and that was it. And I showed this to them and was all right, what do you think? And they had a sheet that had observation and then hypothesis on it. So they first had to just make their observation. So what did they see? And that was also teaching them in itself how to distinguish between what your observation is and what you think about it, because it might not be right what you think, but at least you can record what you see. So for example, this is a ship, a picture of the ship, and so they were looking really closely at it, they were recording on what they see, and then we had a discussion about what they thought about it. So this brought on a lot of conversation about if you see they're very close together, and then I was what would the implications be of that? And then they were able to discuss amongst themselves. So 5th grade's a really fun grade because they're able to have this discourse that is student-led, so they would ask a question and then I would just be like, all right, you can answer it, like if you want. They would just talk about it. So, for example, thinking about people being really close together, they would talk about how diseases would be spread quickly, like people would be sick. We did also, so I found, in addition, we looked at the textbook, but then I found in addition like other resources that were more accurate for them to read, and they would read them in groups and discuss them. So, for example, the illnesses, and then they learned that they were like actually shackled, so we talked about what that meant, and so then they asked the question like, well, what happens when you have to go to the bathroom? And I'm like, yeah, what happens? So they talked about that, and they're like, well, no one was letting them go, so how like just how awful the environment was, and so this led, and then there was also if someone like died or got sick, it said they'd be thrown overboard, and they were just like appalled by this. They're like, how could somebody treat another human like that? And this brought into, on the next slide I have the topics that we discussed, but one topic was I introduced the idea of dehumanization. So that was something that originally you would never think a fifth grader could understand. But when it was put, they were able to put it in like simpler terms for themselves, like treating someone like they don't matter, like they're not human. We were able to bring that to another level and talk about the idea of dehumanization and how that occurs in the past and how it occurs today. So student-led discussions were based on questions that were crafted through the inquiry, so the students were the ones leading the discussions. Also, there was an assessment on slavery in a writing piece that was focused on tolerance. So we talked about as a class like how, so being tolerant, a lot of times people think, like I was telling my friends about my project and they were like, well, doesn't tolerant mean to like only tolerate it, to not, and like, which is a very common definition of the word tolerance, but especially in the sense of education, there's a whole program called Teaching Tolerance, and it really just talks about educating and enabling people to become more aware and like educated on just issues of diversity. And then also, I found that empathy led to activism. So the unit itself brought out a lot of emotions from students, and I think that that's what this unit I learned the most from, was that students, when they're learning about these issues that really like are powerful and kind of appalling for them, it made them feel so strongly that they wanted to know more. And a lot of questions that were brought up, so dehumanization, but also equity versus equality. So we talked about how, so racism, for example, is not something that, like it's out of a lot of people's control, but as students, they were saying how they think about the fact that people are at like a disadvantage to other people, and that they were thinking about, well, if someone, we were talking about, for example, on a test, like if someone, for them to understand, is able to have like a graphic organizer opposed to someone who isn't, and how that puts them ahead. But then we were saying, but they might have maybe like a learning disability. So we were talking about like on that kind of like scope for them. So just thinking about like the difference between what people have and what people don't have, and then also racism. So this is something that we found through the topic of slavery. So thinking about how in the past, like Black people were looked at as like less than human, and they weren't respected like white people were. So we were talking about that now, and we only have one student who's Black in our class, and a lot of times people would think like that would make it really uncomfortable, and she was actually super involved in the conversations, and she was just talking about it really openly, and we had like a lot of discussions about like DNA as well. Like it was just a really like in-depth unit. So we're talking about how with DNA you could look I like really similar to someone, but you could have DNA more similar to someone who was Black, for example. Like we were comparing like things like that. So yeah, so one thing is a lot of the research that I did on this was like, but isn't it uncomfortable? So it was talking about how a lot of teachers think that it would be bad to talk to students about this, and that you shouldn't have these conversations because they're too serious of topics to talk about. But I found that through research and from doing it. So it's really important to set clear expectations. So when you're having these very serious conversations with children, it's really important that they know they're able to express their opinion, but that you have to be respectful of it. So we had, I had them, first I put what should our class look and sound like during these discussions, and they would put up, and this is what we came up with based on these sticky notes. So be respectful, only one person speaks at a time, so no like calling out and yelling at people, because that can happen if you don't have these strict rules. Also creating a classroom community, so being able to have students feel safe in the classroom and an environment where they feel comfortable talking about these things, and then also recognizing the diversity of your students. So this is something that I found we were able to pull a lot because we focused on the culture of West African. So students, for example, we talked about traditions and stories that were told. So then students were able to incorporate their own culture into that. So we have a lot of students who are like Portuguese, and they were able to incorporate their traditions and stories that were passed down from their family. So it was really nice to see students bring their own culture into the classroom. And then also allowing children to express their opinions and ask questions. So this is really important. I think from honors we learned this too, like always question things. So students, even if it was written in the textbook or if they could always ask questions about it. So a quote that I had found was, "Colorblindness creates a society that denies negative and racial experiences, rejects cultural heritage, and invalidates unique perspectives." So colorblindness is the idea that if you don't see color and if you kind of almost like pretend race doesn't exist, that it's going to eliminate racism. And this is definitely found not to be true. It actually causes anxiety for a lot of children, because when they have to face a conversation about race or someone who looks different than them, it creates a lot of confusion. Also, everyone has implicit biases that they are unaware of in regards to race, so you may not realize it and may not consciously think about the fact that you have these biases, but even children, so when children are young, they recognize race and they develop biases from a very young age. Also that many teachers and parents are afraid to talk about race, and a lot of it's for fear of offending people. So I think that this is really important to recognize and for people to be aware of, and now educate other people on, because if you're not aware of your own biases, you can never know that this is like what's going on. And then also the impact on society. So the idea of people being colorblind and that racism does exist. I think especially, I took a class last semester, senior seminar, and it was on race, and a lot of people believed that, especially after Barack Obama was president, that we were a post-racial society, and it's not true, obviously. There's a lot of things that are affected by race, especially, so housing, for example, or employment. If you are of any other race other than white, typically, it's more likely that you're going to be denied housing if you applied for something or a job. Also, the education system, Michaela talked about like the expectations of students, and a lot of times with these stereotypes, students don't think they can live up to what the same expectation that people would have of white students. And then just some things about how my personal identity has been shaped by honors and by my experience at Roger Williams. So I came in not as a psychology major, and my experience through my community engagement and my courses that I've taken here have led me to become a teacher. Also, I think I've been able to advocate for myself and others. So as a teacher, you need to recognize what students need and what I need. So I've had a very tough experience with student teaching, and it's really it required me to become an advocate for myself and realize what I need, what my students need. Also ask questions. So I remember this from literature and philosophy. I feel like we talked about all the time, always questioning, and how Michaela said about ignorance, you're never going to know what you don't know until you figure it out, kind of, if that makes sense. And then to collaborate within a professional learning community. So I've learned this through student teaching and through my courses here, is that it's really important to collaborate, because you can learn so many different ideas from other people who are in whether it's a different discipline or if it's on, for example, in school on the same team. And also a growth mindset. So I think that, not that I came in with a fixed mindset, but that I realized how much there is to learn, and that you're really never done learning. So even though we're graduating, I'm always going to be a lifelong learner. And then, so what can you do in regards to this topic? So really initiate racial discourse with adults and children. So I found through my unit on slavery and through talking with my students that it's really important to kind of start the conversation, because a lot of times people aren't aware of it and they don't know how to talk about it until you kind of just make them talk about it. So, for example, if you are a teacher, if you are in the public, like, use your own power and privilege to educate people, and kind of just explain to them what it is, and just bring up, because a lot of people honestly will believe that we are a post-racial society. So just kind of bringing this up will allow people to explore their own implicit biases. So not only can you think about what your biases might be, but then when you make other people aware of it, they become more willing to become an advocate. Also, just seek opportunities for diversity and inclusion. So think about incorporating other cultures, trying something new, and then celebrate all differences in diversity. So in my own classroom, we talk a lot about the students' personal experiences and where they come from, and just incorporating that so that everyone feels welcome. And that's it.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Skylar Roberts, and today I'll be presenting my honors capstone, which is titled Localizing Vibrio Parahemolyticus in Crustacea virginica using in situ hybridization and qPCR. I'm a double major in marine biology and environmental science, and all of this work was performed in the Aquatic Diagnostic Lab under the mentorship of Dr. Smallwood. So first I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction. So Vibrio parahemolyticus, or VP for short, is just a bacteria that lives in the water column all around the world, including right here in Rhode Island. And the eastern oyster filter feeds its food, but when it's filter feeding, it can't be selective, so it also takes these bacteria in during these processes. And these bacteria don't actually affect the oysters themselves, but when a human eats a raw oyster that has high concentrations of VP, they can become very sick from it. It causes gastroenteritis-like symptoms, and it can also be fatal to those who are immunocompromised. So this is a really big issue for shellfish farmers right now, especially because we're seeing an increase in cases of the illness as climate change causes our waters to get warmer. Viruses, bacteria, and parasites are able to expand their natural ranges and enter new areas. So all of our water conditions in Cape Cod and Rhode Island are changing, and we're seeing new organisms present. And also, when someone becomes sick from an oyster, the farm that oyster came from is often forced to shut down their entire harvest. So the purpose of my study was to determine where within the oyster cells and tissues the bacteria resides when it's taken in during those filter feeding processes, because we believe that this information is necessary to create a more efficient depuration technique. So depuration is a process in which bivalves, including oysters, are held in certain conditions to maximize their natural filter feeding activities, and this can lead to them being rid of impurities, which may include bacteria. So currently there are methods already being used by farmers to help depurate VP from oysters, and these include UV light, chlorinated seawater, and refrigeration. However, most of these methods have little effect. None of them are foolproof and guarantee that there's no VP left in the oyster, and they're timely and cost a lot of money. So that's why research needs to be done to create more efficient techniques for these farmers. So for my methods, I collected oysters from Roger Williams' Learning Dock, and I actually inoculated them with the bacteria VP at 3 different concentrations for 2 different time intervals. So that top picture in the corner is just my tank set up with my oysters, where I would inoculate them with the bacteria. I would let them sit in the tank and filter the bacteria, and then I removed them from the tanks, and I sterilely structured them and removed 4 different tissue types from each oyster. I removed a section of the digestive gland. I removed the entire heart from the individual, as well as a section of the mantle and the gill. All 4 of these tissues were stored in ethanol so that I could extract their DNA for qPCR, which I will talk about a little bit later. And then I stored the rest of the body of the oyster in formalin for in situ hybridization. So this technique is commonly used among scientists, and it basically uses probes, which are strands of nucleotides. So nucleotides are the building blocks of DNA. And you can design probes to be specific for genes of a certain organism. So I designed my probes based off of these 3 genes up top. The names of them aren't really important. but just know that my probes match the sequence of DNA of these bacteria. So the way in situ hybridization works is that you run it through this process, and then the end result is that you'll have a slide with oyster tissue on it, and you can actually stain the DNA of the bacteria without staining the DNA of the oyster. So you can look at the slide under a microscope and see those stained bacteria. So the first step is to rehydrate the tissues of the oyster using ethanol. And then you do pre-hybridization, which basically neutralizes any enzymes within the tissues that may react with your stain. So you ensure that you're not staining anything in the oyster tissue. Hybridization occurs, which is when your probes, based off of those genes of the bacteria, actually go and bind to your bacterial DNA. Then you use a blocking solution, which again is just used to help prevent any background staining. And then an antibody solution, so these antibodies go and they attach to your probes, because then you're actually able to stain those antibodies. So the stain is anywhere from bright purple to black, and then that's how you can actually see your bacteria. So this is just an example of kind of what I was looking at when I was looking for the staining. So on your left, in that red circle, you can see the stained bacteria. They're distinctly rod-shaped. And then the picture on your right is just my control slide, so we actually didn't add any antibody solution to that to ensure that it really was the VP that we were staining. So this is just an example of the gill tissue of an oyster, and this oyster was actually inoculated at 450 cells VP per milliliter. And then here are some more pictures just showing you the same thing. You have some mantle tissue with stained bacteria. We saw it in the intestine as well as phagocytes within the digestive gland. And then I also performed qPCR, and that stands for quantitative polymerase chain reaction. And basically this is a technique used by scientists. So like I said earlier, I extracted the DNA from those tissue samples. So that DNA was both oyster tissue and, both oyster DNA and bacteria DNA. And then you can target those bacterial genes and actually amplify them millions of times, and then you can actually quantify it. So your VP concentration, which is on the y-axis, and copy number actually correlates to the amount of bacteria.
Oh,
So here,
7:30, we have a club meeting.
It's 7:30.
Yeah, just didn't know how long you guys were gonna be here.
It's about 6:10
All
or
right.
6:05.
All right, sorry for the disturbance.
okay, so on the x-axis, you have those four tissue types again: digestive gland, gill, heart, and mantle. So you can see that we were seeing a lot of bacteria in the digestive gland, the gill, and the mantle, which is the same as what we saw with our in situ hybridization staining results, and almost none in the heart, which was interesting. So my conclusions for this research was that staining was primarily within the mucus cells of the mantle, gill, and within cells in the digestive gland. And this was good news for us because we hypothesized that the relationship with the epithelium surface, which is just the surface layer of the tissue, means that decoration is potentially would be more successful compared to if we saw staining of the bacteria deeply embedded within the connective tissue. So this is a good thing for us. However, moving forward, we would have to do more studies using different concentrations of bacteria and for different time intervals. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about how this actually relates to the honors program and my experience in the honors program. So for my community engagement, I took the class with Dr. Turner. And we talked a lot about things like food insecurity and the workforce. So I actually wanted to hear more from the farmers. And I was lucky enough to actually be able to go down to Wellfleet with the diagnostics lab and work alongside the farmers. So this is just a picture of some of us working down there. And what I learned from this experience is that shellfish farming has been in these families for years, or sometimes even in generations. So like other forms of farming, this is really a way of life for these people. It's part of their identity and it's part of their culture. And in recent years, farmers have seen a decline in their stocks due to these diseases, and the industry is becoming a very high-stress environment. So it is very sad to be down there and to be working alongside them and to hear all of these stories about how they're struggling to make ends meet. And then talking more along about food insecurity, I wanted to think about this more on a global scale. So I found that there's actually some countries in Asia that have villages and their main industry there is shellfish farming. So these people rely on shellfish farming as their main food source and as their main economy. So if disease continues to spread and we're really seeing more hardships in this industry, these people are going to become food insecure, they're not going to know where their next meal is, and it's also going to be a huge loss to their economy as well. So then this is just a little schematic showing you guys the whole process. So I've already talked about the farmers a little bit, but after the farmers, the shellfish go to a broker or a middleman, and then they get sent to restaurants, and then they're sent to the consumers. So I have two statistics here. So in 2017, shellfish in the US alone had an estimated value of $340 million. So this is a really big part of the United States economy. And then globally, it was a value of $19 billion. So this is a really big economic impact for us. And if this is occurring at the farming level, that means the 3 other tiers are also going to be affected. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the consumers. So this is a graph showing you world aquaculture production. And you have 2 different colors here. You have light blue and dark blue. So light blue is seafood that is actually captured production. So this means people are going out and they're catching wild seafood, wild fish, or shellfish as well. And it's going straight to the market. And then the dark blue is your aquaculture production. So these are farmed seafood. So whether it comes from eggs or seed, this is not seafood that is being caught from the wild. So aquaculture is really important because, as you can see, in recent years, our capture production is starting to level off, and it's no longer increasing, which is really important because this means we're no longer fishing as much in the ocean. And as you guys, I'm sure all know, the ocean is extremely overfished and overharvested, and we're really depleting a lot of those populations. So it's really important that we have aquaculture to kind of buffer those impacts. And if we start to see a decline in aquaculture production, that means we're going to have to see an increase in capture production again, and we definitely don't want to do that. So specifically, why oysters? I'm sure most of you don't really care much about oysters, but they're actually really important to the environment. So they filter water and remove nitrogen waste, and they also improve water clarity. And this is really important for aquatic plants. They also form reefs, so corals actually aren't the only animals that are reef formers. Oysters do it as well, and this provides structure for habitat, encouraging biodiversity. And they're also an essential food source for a lot of animals, such as crabs, seabirds, and starfish. So something that you guys can do as a consumer, this is an app that's actually produced by the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and it's free to download on any phone. And this app allows you to find local businesses near you that sell sustainable seafood. You can also get recommendations of what seafood is okay and not okay to eat, and also more information on aquaculture and wild-caught species as well. And then finally, just how this has impacted me a little bit. So I know I only got to show you guys a really small part of my research, but I've actually been working on this project for 3 years. I started it my sophomore year. And basically what I've learned from this is science and research comes with a lot of failures and roadblocks. The first 1.5 years I was doing this, I actually didn't get any results at all because I couldn't get the protocol to work. And there was a lot of times where I wanted to quit and I didn't want to do it anymore. But being an honors student, I really had to think more so about that community impact that it was having. And I remember when I was choosing my senior thesis, my faculty mentor, Dr. Smuller, was actually asking me if I wanted to switch projects. She's like, you don't have to do this for your thesis if you don't want to, because I know it's not working. But I knew the project was really important to her, and it was really important to the farmers. So I decided to stick with it, and I'm really glad that I did, because I finally got results. And I'm just really proud of myself. So I think being an honors student, you just have to remind yourself why you're doing the research that you're doing and why you're involved in it and what's the community that you're impacting. And this is definitely something that the honors program has taught me. And I've decided that I want to combine my research with conservation and potentially pursue a graduate degree in this field because of this research. And then these are my acknowledgements. I'd like to thank all of my funding, my thesis committee, my lab techs, and all of my lab members. And my references.
Bringing all 3 of our presenters back up, it's 5:52, so we have a few minutes for questions. Audience members, we can ask about how their projects connect to honors values, honors ideas. We can ask about topics specifically, or we could ask about, for those of you who are going to be doing this in the future, thinking about your own capstones and how they can help you if you have questions about how they did it and what they learned and so forth. So, any student questions first? Hearing none. Dr. Hendrickson? Or
Go ahead. No, yeah, I'm still thinking about it.
Skylar, very interesting project. If I was going to suggest that someone from RWU Marketing come to tell your story on the website, what would the title be that we should put on the article on the RWU webpage?
To come to, sorry, can you do that?
Like if we're going to tell the story of the work you've done.
Oh, okay.
Like I wouldn't use the title you use.
Right, yeah, so
What
that
would
was
be a
my
title
research
that-
title. Probably something more so like, I'd want to focus on the impacts of shellfish disease. So maybe something like climate change, like, or maybe something like 50 years you may no longer be able to eat oysters or something like that to grab people's attention, because that's also true. In 50 years we might not have oysters in the market anymore. So maybe something like that.
Thank you.
So I do have a question for Lily. You talked about having to learn to advocate for yourself as a student teacher and how that experience was difficult. Could you maybe just say a little bit more about maybe your growth as a teacher through that experience, or how you sort of overcame some of that adversity? Or
Yeah, well, okay, I won't go into total specifics, but I ended up having to move placements last semester because it was not a very good, it was very uncomfortable, like it wasn't working with the host teacher. So I moved placement, this placement also not doing very well. But I think, so right now, like for example, I've had to, she doesn't watch this, but I've had to do pretty much everything on my own. So the point of a host teacher is to plan with you and to like help you pretty much. And I've kind of just been thrown to the wolves this entire semester. And I've had to work with like the School of Education and with like the principals at the school, because to try and also other, like I was talking about collaboration, like the whole 5th grade team has kind of helped me more than my teacher has. So I think just being in that kind of situation like has allowed me to see for my students, like if you're not understanding something or you're feeling you're not getting help, like it's very scary. And like so I've developed really close relationships with all of my students, and like they know I've created that kind of like support for them, so they know if they need anything, like they can come to me. So I think like knowing to advocate for myself, and like I was able to switch placements because I finally said something. So I think that's kind of just how I've grown, and like now like interviewing for jobs, I have a job now. So like I think just realizing that you're able to overcome a lot.
congrats on the job.
Thanks.
And I want to kind of ask a follow-up question too. Maybe this is for Lily and Michaela. I mean, do you find that your pedagogies, which maybe push up against traditional narratives, are these pedagogies being well received by the faculty and administration at the institutions where you're teaching, or are you receiving pushback in any form?
My teacher in specific, she has been teaching for years, but she actually has a really diverse background. She's adopted kids from 5 different countries, so she's really interested in other perspectives, so she really does accept these different viewpoints that I present in the classroom, and she's all for it.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times it's not as much that people aren't like as accepting, like especially in education. I think it's that education, there's what you'll find in teaching is that there's never enough time for everything. Like you're always going to feel rushed, you're always going to feel like you have to finish a unit in time for something. So say it's like for testing, you need to have done this in time. So I think that these new ideas kind of not like stray from the curriculum, but it almost adds to it. So I think the biggest issue is that, like, so I would propose an idea and it was almost like, well, I don't know if we're going to have time for that, something like that, sort of.
I'd also say a huge thing is like underestimating the students. Like if you want to say, I want to do an inquiry-based lesson about like some community problem, and they'll be like, oh, do you think they're really going to be interested and engaged in that? And then you'll do it and they're all for it and they love it and they're having so much fun and learning so much, and they can do research on the computers even like at age 7, which is amazing. So I definitely would say that my host teacher can underestimate them sometimes, but I wouldn't say I get any pushback.
Yeah, I think, sorry, just one thing to add to that is like the underestimating. So like my question was like, are they able to even have conversations like that? And I did, for social studies, we were in the class together last semester, I did a whole unit on teaching tolerance, so all the aspects, so not only racism, but like LGBTQ and just being able to incorporate that into your classroom, even with, so say, first or second graders. There's a lot of books, so you can incorporate children's books that talk about like gender and stereotypes, and kind of just bringing that into the classroom at a young age is what I think is so important, because it starts with children. And right now, even if there's some adults who like maybe don't want to be open to that, if we start bringing it into our schools and having children become advocates, they can then hopefully change the future. It sounds kind of corny, but.
I have a question for Skylar, but I don't want to give you a shot.
No.
Okay, so I always appreciate that sort of like direct to consumer kind of like, this is what you can do to change, right? The larger sort of economic forces that, right, tend to value maybe less sustainable, right, aquaculture or something like that, right? And are there things that you think need to be done on a larger scale? I mean, obviously, we can do things to try to slow climate change, right? Do you think there are other sort of larger policy level things we can do to encourage sustainable practices that protect sort of?
Right. Well, so one of the big things too, climate change is a huge issue, but another reason why we're seeing more parasites and bacteria over here too is due to transportation from ships and things like that. And I think a lot of times we use ships because it's a lot cheaper than other ways of transportation, and also ships usually are the ones that produce the most carbon dioxide. So I think policies in terms of transportation, the way we're shipping our goods, is really important. In terms of other things for consumers to do, I honestly think that, as I said, if aquaculture declines, we're going to see an increase in capture production to meet world needs. But I think that maybe we should cut back on our seafood a little bit, because right now there's really no laws saying how much seafood we can consume. There's laws how much we can take from the ocean, but a lot of them aren't really that great, and there's a lot of loops to get around that. So I think just enforcing stricter laws on fishing and things like that as well.
Or is there a role for transitioning, again, back to the consumer level, transitioning, eat the kelp instead of the oyster, right?
Yeah.
Right, so
Choosing different types of food. I mean, and even doesn't apply to seafood, like even if you don't eat meat, things like palm oil and soy, those are like the main causes of deforestation, and they requires so much water to make them. So I think just researching what food you're eating and choosing better options.
A question for Michaela. Why do you think it is that these textbooks that are in some ways so dated or outright wrong, and you pointed out like historical facts that are just routinely misrepresented, right, in textbooks, why do you think it is that they persist? And what can we, society, individuals, what can we do to get better textbooks into our children's classrooms?
Yeah, so I think a huge thing is the idea, again, of like underestimating the kids. We don't want to teach them that Columbus did all these terrible things because that's too above their heads, and so we can't put that in the textbook. Same thing with like a lot of different people. Like we can talk about war, but not into deep detail and stuff like that. In terms of getting away from textbooks, I'm not a huge fan of textbooks in general. I'm more into like, as a teacher, using primary sources, using quotes, letting kids figure things out for themselves. Like, what's with this quote, what stance do you think they were taking in this picture? Like, sort of like Lily was doing, what do you think is going on in this picture? Looking into more primary source documents so that you can learn more accurate information.
Does that put a bigger burden on the teacher?
It does, but it makes you feel better because you're teaching the right thing.
Audience questions?
I have a question for Skylar. What do you think your biggest limitation was, like, in your research process?
I think something I struggled with was, before I even started the research, anytime you're doing something with disease, there's going to be negative feedback from that specific community. So I found something, when I went to conferences, people weren't necessarily happy that I was studying VP because farmers don't necessarily want to hear about it. Because if they're hearing about new disease, that just means more regulations and things for them to follow, and it's often going to cost them more money. So I think my biggest hurdle would be getting over that and realizing that the research I'm doing is really better for the community in the end. but you're going to be faced with a lot of negative feedback in the beginning. And that was something I was limited by in the beginning, and I didn't necessarily even want to do the research. When I go to conferences and people are like, oh, I don't want to hear about this, but it's something you have to realize that it's going to benefit it in the long run.
It's 6 o'clock. I want to thank our presenters again. They're all interesting presentations. Thank you to the audience for turning out. If you haven't signed the sign-in sheet yet, it's in the back. Please do so before you go. And thank you for another good year, Sash. And we look forward to next year.